Okay, so let's go back to the bottom of the Kuf Samach Tesam and Beis. There's a dot, like 4 lines before the bottom of the Gemara. The Gemara says Tanu Rabbanan. So we're at the point over here where the Gemara wants to explain the Machloikis in our Gemara, where Reb Shimon ben Gamliel says that you're not allowed to give a spare star even to someone who purchases a property, even if you write in the spare star that he cannot be typhus anything with it, meaning even if a Bachoif takes it away, he can't go after anybody. So all that star can be used for is to prove that he in fact purchased his property. You still can't give them such a star. And the reason why you can't give them such a star is because it's quite possible that the reason why he doesn't have his star anymore is because he returned the star to the moicher. So in our case, we were always talking about Reuven buying a property from Shimon. Maybe Reuven returned the star to the moicher. Now, according to Rabbanan, returning the star has zero impact. So therefore, who cares if he returned it to the moicher? It's still his property, so we will give him a star, a spare star, to tell him that it's still his property. But according to Reb Shimon ben Gamliel, where there's a realistic chance that he gave back that star because he no longer wanted that property, if he says he lost it, maybe he didn't lose it. Maybe he actually gave it back. And now he wants a spare star because he changed his mind and he wants to reassert himself in it. So we can't give him a spare star because that spare star could possibly be used for fraud. And the Gemara concluded that Reb Shimon ben Gamliel says, Oisius niklas b'mesira. And therefore, merely by returning a star of something that you purchased, that actually reverses the transaction and it's no longer yours. If that could happen, then we need to be really careful about issuing a spare star, because Reb Shimon ben Gamliel holds oisios niknas b'mesira. So Tanu Rabbanan, habal lidoin b'shtar uvechazaka. What if there is a claim made against Reuven? Reuven bought a property, and Shimon is ma'ar and said, I never sold that property to you. And Reuven has two options to defend himself. He can defend himself with shtar, and he'll have proof with the shtar that he purchased the property, or b'chazaka, and it's fluid what that chazaka could mean, because we know chazaka could mean someone was there for 3 years, b'shufi, no one bothered him, so that would be proof, in fact, that it's his, and he has a right to lose his shtar at that point. But we're going to see in the Gemara that chazaka might also mean a kinyan chazaka, like null parats. If you did some material thing to the field, that shows your ownership, and that's a kinyan. So what it means will come out in how we are mefarish this brisa. So the halacha is nidain b'shtar. Divrei Rebbe. Rebbe holds you use a star. Reb Shimon ben Gamliel oimer b'chazaka. Reb Shimon ben Gamliel says no, use chazaka. So let's understand what this discussion is about, and then it'll help us understand what chazaka is. But my kamifli, ki aser Rav Dimi, Amar Rav Dimi explained to us that be'oisios niklas b'mesir kamifli. And the case was that when Reuven bought this property from Shimon, Shimon never wrote a bill of sale to Reuven saying, I, Shimon, I'm selling you this field. What happened was Shimon actually just bought this field from Levi. So Shimon had a star in his hand that says, I, Levi, sold my property to Shimon. And all Shimon did was he handed to Reuven that star. And since Rebbe holds oisios niknois b'mesira, merely giving a third-party star to Reuven will actually transfer the ownership of that property to Reuven, because that star is the handle. That is the control of the property. So what Reuven is going to pull out to prove bishtar, according to Rebbe, is a star that's not even written to him. It'll be a third-party star that Levi wrote to Shimon, and by Reuven presenting that, and Reuven holding on to that, that's how Reuven can assert his ownership of this property. Because oisios niklas b'mesira. It's like you know what it's like? It's like if you have a sefer, and I assert that it's my sefer that you have, you're holding it. So hamoitzi mechaver alavaraya. Reuven is holding the star, oisios niklas b'mesira. He is holding on to the property. So hamoitzi mechaver alavaraya. Well, every star maybe you just found.
Yeah, but it doesn't have a name.
But since Oisius Nigdus B'Mesira, that star is the power of the property. The good thing is you're in good company, because Rab Shimon ben Gamliel here says, Rab Shimon ben Gamliel, Savar Ein Oisius Nigdus B'Mesira, that wouldn't be a good kinyan at all. So there's no way Reuven was able to purchase the property from Shimon merely by holding on to that star. So Reuven would have to show that he made a kinyan chazak on it. So really, to answer what Duvi's asking is, that star is not necessarily the raya. That he might have two edim that Reuven might have two edim that Shimon actually handed that star to him. But if that has no impact, then what's the difference? So let's say Reuven had two edim that Shimon gave him the star. The question is, was Reuven koined anyway? According to Rebbe, Reuven was actually koined. So maybe I should take a step back from what I said before, that's a raya, because that's not the discussion here at all. The discussion here is not at all as to whether or not that star is a raya. The question is, if Reuven could bring edim that Shimon gave him the star, the edim are his raya. But was that a transaction? Merely Shimon handing over a third-party star to Reuven, is that a good way to be makna to Reuven the property? Rebbe holds it is. So he's done a legitimate transaction, and the property actually got transferred to his ownership. While Reb Shimon ben Gamliel says, even if you have edim, even if Reuven brings edim that Shimon handed him that star, it has zero impact, because that's not a kinyan, because they know he's nigdus b'Mesira. But if Reuven has edim that Shimon told him, Leich chazeku kni, go make a kinyan on the property, and then he has edim that he actually made a kinyan on the property, a legitimate kinyan on the property, then it's his. So the Shimon Gamliel Savar Ein Oisius Nigdus B'Mesira. Rabbi Savar Oisius Nigdus B'Mesira. We have a massive problem. The problem that we have over here is that a moment ago, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel said Oisius Nigdus B'Mesira, and it was Rebbe who said Ein Oisius Nigdus B'Mesira. Here, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel is taking exactly the opposite position. Okay. I want to do a little bit of a Rashbam over here that talks about Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel and Rebbe. Because the halacha is, whenever Rebbe says a halacha b'Mishnah Seinu, halacha kamoisoi, Rebbe, halacha ka Rebbe mechaveiroi, v'loi mechaveirov. Right? The halacha is like Rebbe if he's arguing with an individual, not if he's arguing with the public. But what if he's arguing with his Rebbe? Well, what if he's arguing with his father? Do you know who Rebbe's father was? Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. So do you paskin like Rebbe, even though he's arguing with his father? Is Rebbe even allowed to argue with his father? So that opens up a whole sugya here. So let's have a quick look at the Rashbam, because the Rashbam comments on this machlokes between Rebbe and Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. Let me see if I can find where he comments on it, where he says the halacha is. I think it's this long one. Here it is. The less hilchasa to Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. Even though the Rach says that we don't pass like Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, we pass like Rebbe. The Yochid v'Rabim halacha karabim afilu hachi hilchasa Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel the oisios niknois b'Mesira v'alvapi shalakosov loy b'shtar shalakosov loy b'shtar acher kni lachi b'chol shideh. The kaimalon kerebi, we pass like Rebbe. The svir lay oisios niknois b'Mesira ba'moicher sasfina. So the Rashbam gets into a discussion, who is the halacha like? And the Rashbam passes halacha l'maisa, that the halacha is like the Rashbam is saying, according to the Rach, that halacha is like Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. So even though halacha Rebbe mechaveroi, I guess it doesn't apply to when Rebbe is arguing with his father. Maybe he does. So there's a whole discussion: is a son allowed to argue with his father? We know Eza kibud, that's not contradicting your father's words. Is arguing halacha shaila, is that considered contradicting your father's words that would not be allowed? And in fact, the Goyin says that No, I'm sorry. The Rambam says when he discusses it, tells Kibbutz Avayim, he says that you're not allowed to contradict your father's words. That's when he's speaking, you're not allowed to contradict him. But if you have a different position than him in halacha and you have rise to it, avada, you're allowed to paskin connected your father, and he brings kama b'kama rise that you're allowed to. So there's a whole discussion about it, and ad kedei kach that there was a posik. Let me think who this posik was. I believe it was. Maybe it was Reb Chaim Volozhner. I believe it was Reb Chaim Volozhner, and he paskined in one of his tshuvas neged his Rebbe, and he writes, even though I'm terrified to paskin neged my Rebbe, and I forgot which big gadol it was referring to, who was his Rebbe, who was a Kohen. He writes in the Shuvah, even though I'm afraid to go connected the Kohen Gadol, my great Rebbe, but I have a Kabbalah from another Rebbe, who was the Vilna Gaon, he writes, that if when you paskin, you're not allowed to show deference to anybody. If you hold the halacha a certain way, you have to have the courage to be able to paskin that way. So he says, even though I'm terrified to take a position neged my Rebbe, who's this Kohen, nevertheless, my Rebbe told me that I'm not allowed to back down if I'm not sure. And he brings down there that the Beis Halevi said that he has a Kabbalah, which I think he says stems from the Vilna Gaon, that if you hear a halacha and you think this is the halacha, you should pass until, not including ad v'lo b'chlal, up until the rush. That's what the Beis Halevi had such a Kabbalah. And the story goes where the Beis Halevi was paskening on the shaila, and he had a policy before he would pasken on the shaila, and it was a difficult shaila. Could be it was an aguna shaila even. He always wanted to leave it overnight. He came to a conclusion, but he wanted to always think about it overnight. And what happened is that night he dreamt that he shouldn't release the tshuva that he wrote, and because of that he decided, you know what? Let me think it over a second night. And the second night he had the same dream as well. He had this dream 3 nights in a row, not to release the psak. On the 4th day, it was brought to his attention that the rush says not like him. So it's stimmed that he had to back down on his psak. Okay, that's just a very short synopsis of a raid bite from Shmuley Bornstein that I was fortunate enough to listen to yesterday.
Yes, he wasn't there the story with Rav Moshe Feinstein Aguna, the first stock that he had to make, and he went against it.
Yes, he went against
the Rogachover? No, it couldn't have been the Rogachover.
Chaim Moser. He went against
Chaim Moser.
Yeah, what happened? He was a young growth. And he was hoping, on the first weekend, it'll be shot about pots, about chickens. And what happened is a woman comes to him and says, "I'm an aguna, and you know what it is. Even if I had a get to find somebody to marry a widow, it's not going to happen." And punkt, there's someone passing through the city, and he's willing to marry me, but he's leaving Sunday. This was like Tuesday. He's leaving Sunday. If I have a psak by Sunday, then I might be able to marry him, and my life won't be ruined. But if not, where am I ever going to find somebody again? And just in case, lest you think that that's an unlikely scenario, that I will tell you what happened to my uncle, who lived happily ever after with his wife till the ripe old age of 103. My uncle, after the war, he had lost his first wife, and he was going on a train with his sister to a different city because a shidduch was read to him from a different village, a different city in Europe, and he was going with his sister to meet that girl to see if he would marry her. And on the train, there was a lady, and they were talking, and she was a very nice lady. So my uncle said, "Why should I schlep to that city? She's a very nice lady. I met her on the train. I'm happy to marry her." And that's what happened. He married this lady who he met on the train, and they lived happily ever after. They lived together for another 60 years, right? So in those days, I guess shidduchim aren't as complicated, or weren't as complicated as they are today. He didn't have to ask, "Does your father have money?" Because he knew that her father wasn't alive anymore. Nobody's father was alive. So it's realistic. He came, he liked her, we'll marry, finished. So she went to Reb Moshe and asked him the shaila, and Reb Moshe realizes that this shaila was a very difficult shaila, way over his head. So he said, okay, he wrote a letter quickly to Reb Chaim Moshe. I guess he was in the next city, and he sent this letter to Reb Chaim Moshe asking him the shaila. So let's say he sends it on Tuesday. On Wednesday, the letter comes back from Reb Chaim Moshe. I'm really, really sorry, but this is a very difficult shaila, and I'm very busy now. I'm not going to be able to have an answer for you right away. It's going to take me some time to get you an answer. So now the Chavetz Chaim, Reb Moshe was stuck. He had to pass in the shaila. So he locked himself up in a room and he scanned Kol HaTorah Kula to see how to paskin, and he came out that the woman is mutter. So she was delighted. She was mutter. They got married, and hopefully she lived happily ever after. I don't know who she is, so I don't know who if they lived happily ever after. But they lived happily ever after. Then on Tuesday, a letter comes back from Reb Chaim Moshe that said, "Yeah, I to the shaila, and this woman is usher." And Reb Moshe said, I did what I was supposed to do. I followed Allah as a psak. I went through Kol HaTorah Kula, and I learned it with the pshat how I understood it to the best of my abilities, and I stand by psak. So that I guess that falls under this same category. Yeah. Okay, Zok to Gemara, and okay, we're diverting too much, but Reb Moshe wasn't an arrogant poskin in any sense of the word. He was very humble, and he writes in his svarim. Why, when he came to America, he says, why do I answer shilos in America? Who am I to answer shilos? Maybe I'm not royal kach. Maybe I don't know enough. Maybe I'm not clear enough. And the Gemara says that it's very, very dangerous for a Rav to paskin if he doesn't really know his stuff thoroughly. But the Gemara also says if someone does know stuff thoroughly and he doesn't paskin, it's also huge avera. So it's a double-edged sword. So what caused me ultimately to paskin? Very simple. People knock on my door and ask me, and I can't turn them down. Why can't I turn them down? He said a pasha d'zach. Chazal tell us that David HaMelech's hands were dirty with dam nida, right, and with dam leida. That means ladies were coming to him lining up with shilas, right? Ladies were coming with their undergarments to him. This guy is the king. David HaMelech is the king. Do you know how busy he is? You have any idea what type of responsibilities he has? Does he have time to go look at Maris? There's 1,000 other Rabbanim lach that can look at your Maris. Why is David HaMelech answering shilas of Maris? Is that not a horrible misuse of his time? The Teretz is, Dr. Moshe, you know why he answered? Because he was asked. And when someone comes to ask you a shayla, you're not allowed to turn them away. So he says, people come ask me shaylas, I cannot turn them away. So therefore I have to answer. And the second reason he writes is because when I left to America, my father said, you'll paskin shaylas there. So I know that every time I paskin a shayla, it gives nachas to my father. So I'll keep it up, I'm also going to do it. So that's what Moshe writes. So he was not like an arrogant posik. He was very careful undertaking such a responsibility. So anyway, we're dealing now with a contradiction. In our sugya, Reb Shimon ben Gamliel seems to say Oishis Nikdas b'Masira, and that's why there's a concern. Maybe this purchaser returned the star and in fact reversed the sale. Now he asks harata. Now he wants another star. But in the sugya where someone had an option to bring a raya of chazaka or use the kinyan of chazaka, or use the kinyan of star, we tell him to use the kinyan of chazaka, because the kinyan of star won't work because they know is niknas b'masira. So Amalei Abaye. So Abaye said, Im klein to Damar, you're arguing on what Rabbo said earlier on Amud Beis, telling us what the machlokes is in our Mishnah between Reb Shimon ben Gamliel and the Rabbanim. Amalei. So I'll argue. Big deal. Amalei. So we have a little gears to change. So the Bach tells us to skip this next line. Im kein kasha, the Reb Shimon ben Gamliel, al Reb Shimon ben Gamliel. Okay, you don't want to learn a grabba, but then you'll have a steer in Reb Shimon ben Gamliel, because the only way we're able to find a solution to explain why Reb Shimon ben Gamliel objects to writing this purchaser a backup star is because we're afraid of Oishis Nikdas b'Masira. So how could you tell us over? So in our studio, you're forced to say that Reb Shimon ben Gamliel holds that Oishis is Nikdas b'Masira. So how could you explain the same Reb Shimon ben Gamliel over here as holding Ein Oishis Nikdas b'Masira? Amar Abaye, Zokta Abaye, the machlokes over here with the chazaka and star, where Rebbe says use star and Reb Shimon ben Gamliel says use chazaka as the kinyan, that's not this discussion of of if Aishas Nixis B'Masira. It's a whole different question. And the Gemara is going to offer, I believe, 4 different options as to how we could understand this second machlokes between Rebbe and Reb Shimon ben Gamliel that will not involve Aishas Nixis B'Masira. You know what happened? This star that Rebbe says use as your raya, now this is no longer Kenyan, as your raya to prove that it's your property, it happens to have a pasala 8 on it. So now the question is, can this star be used as a raya since it has a pasala 8 on it? We'll look to there of Meir, Rabbi Lozer Kamavu. Rabbi Savar, and I take that back. It's still a question of whether the star was a good Kenyan. It's not yet, it's still not a discussion of raya, it's a discussion of will the star be a good Kenyan. And it's using the same achloikas that we once learned between Reb Meir and Reb Elazar as follows. Reb Elazar holds oisios nikdas b'masira. The edim that sign on the star are irrelevant. The whole kinyan of the star is done by the edim that watch the star be transferred over. So in the case of, let's say, a get, what validates the get? What validates the kedushin? Is it the star? If it's a star kedushin, is it the edim that signed on the star that validates the kedushin? Is that the edim that are doing the chalois? Or is it the edim that watch the transaction? And the edim signing is just for a formality. But the main engine behind the kinyan will be done by the edim Mesira. So that is the question. Rabbi Shavuot Kabbalazar, the Amar edim Mesir Karsi, and therefore it doesn't matter if the edim on the star are apostle, as long as he could produce the edim Mesira. So now Reuven is being nisara. Shimon saying you're on my property, I never sold it to you, and Shimon and Reuven can pull a star that says he bought it. Now one of the edim on this star is apostle, but Reuven also is producing the edim Mesira that watched the transaction, so that will be good enough. So Rebbe Savar Kabbalazar Edim Mesir Karsi, and therefore by producing edim and the star that was given to him, he has proof that he purchased it with a valid kinyan. So that star didn't affect any type of kinyan because it was a puzzle star. It had a puzzle 8. So therefore, he would need to prove that he made a proper kinyan through kinyan chazaka. So that is another option as to how to learn this machlokes in a way where it has nothing to do with the shaila of oisios nikdas b'masira. And we're no longer talking about a third-party star. We're talking about Reuven producing a star that says, I, Shimon, sold this property to Reuven. Right? But the only problem is that one of the edim on this star was puzzled. Frag the Gemara, this halacha that Rebbe Elazar holds edim Mesir Karsi, and therefore we're not concerned with the validity of the edim that signed on the star, that's very limited in its scope. Yes, Rebbe Elazar holds edim Mesir Karsi, and therefore you don't need edim signing on the star. That's if there's no edim on the star. But if there's a postulate on the star, even Rebbe Elazar would agree that this star will not be valid and the transaction will be bottled. El Amar Ravina, and the Tziyadim changed it to Ravina. El Amar Ravina, Hakal Moedim, Shem Kosev Boy, who's Kaknu La'edish Aledim, Venimtas Edusan Mizuyefes, Shu Puzzle, Kidrababa. Everybody agrees. Even Rebbe Elazar holds edim Mesir Karsi, that's only if the star doesn't have edim. But if a star is puzzle edim, it's not a good star. So then what is the discussion over here with whether or not you should use star, as Rebbe says, or chazaka, as Reb Shimon ben Gamliel says, and that's the case over here, where the star that he's producing will not have edim on it. The Rebbe said, Rebbe Elazar, the edim Mesir Karsi. Rebbe says this is a perfectly valid star, even though it didn't have edim signed on it, but I'm producing edim Mesira that saw Shimon, the seller, give me, Reuven, the buyer, this star, and was marked the property to me through this star. But Reb Shimon ben Gamliel, Savar Reb Meir, Domer Eidich Sima Karsi. And since there's no Eidich Sima, this star was not a valid kinyan, and therefore I have to prove that I was kinyan this property with chazak. So now we have an alternative pshat in this machlokes of Rebbe and Shimon ben Gamliel that in fact has nothing to do with Oishis Niknas B'Masira, so we can still maintain that Reb Shimon ben Gamliel holds Oishis Niknas B'Masira. And the Poish can tell us, of course, that this only works for a star that's being used as a chalois, Edi B'Sir Karsi. But Kula Alma Moida, if it's a star choiv, and I want to prove that you owe me money, and I want to collect from a shubadim, there for sure you would need a dechasima. It's only when it's a question of what does the chalois. Okay, so because of that, we know that the two edim under a chuppah always watch the handing over of the ksuba from the chosan to the kala. Pashtus, the edei kedushin don't have to see that, because by the kedushin they have to see the process because they make the chalois. But the ksuba, there's no chalois happening there. He's mechayiv himself in the shtar, and the shtar is just the kalas to hold on to as a raya. It's only a shtar raya. It's not making a chalois. The kedushin they have to see.
Yeah. Also, actually, the female, they don't have to see. They have to see.
They don't have to know. They don't have to see that. They don't. There's no witnesses required by halal that the ksuba was given over. She just has to have the ksuba.
Yeah. So
Right.
they have to see
So-
when they signed it. Not
The Eid ksuba have to sign. But I'm talking about the Eid kedushin. Don't have to see that being handed over. Zok the Gemara weiter. V'bo yisema. Or you could say that there's a different discussion here between Rebbe and Reb Shimon ben Gamliel about if you should use the star or the chazaka to assert your ownership on this property. Here is a case where Shimon was agreeable. Yes, I wrote this star, but I never gave it to him. I wrote it and I was planning to sell it, but I didn't sell it. So the Rebbe Savar, Moide B'Shtar Shekosvai, Ein Tzarech L'Kaimoi, Reb Shimon ben Gamliel Savar, Tzarech L'Kaimoi. So what was the case? The case was where Shimon tells Reuven, you're in my property. Reuven produces a star that says Shimon sold him the property fair and square. Shimon says, I signed that star, that is true, but I never planned to give it to you. I dropped it. It was cause of Limkar V'Leimachar. So I had written that star, but I never gave it to you, and therefore it's not legitimate. So the question is, in such a case, normally if you're holding a star, that's a raya that you cannot get around. But the question is, once Shimon is challenging, he agrees the star was written, but he's challenging that it was legit. Does Reuven have to independently be mekayim the edim on that star? In other words, once there's an attack on the star, if Shimon would have claimed Mezuyef, for sure, Reuven has to produce Edim to be Mekayim the star. But what if the Taina was not Mezuyef? The Taina was, yes, I signed the star, but I didn't ever sell it to you with that star. Do you also need Kiyum? So, and the question really is, do you say Pesha Asar? Do you say, the only reason why the star is valid is because Shimon is agreeing to you that he signed it, but he's undermining it by saying he never gave it to you? Or do you say, no, once Shimon agreed that he wrote it, the star takes on a life of its own, and the Reuven can use it as a perfect proof. So that would be the shayla. So the question is if Moed B'Shtar Shekos was Tzarech L'Kaimei or not. And the case was, it was Moed B'Shtar Shekos, but Shimon claims he never gave it to you. So Rebbe holds you can use the star, because once Shimon was Moed to the validity of the star, it's a perfect riot. It's not missing anything. But Shimon Gamliel holds, even though Shimon was agreeable that he wrote the star, but since he claims he never sold you the property, in order for Reuven to be able to use it to assert himself, he needs to bring Edim that the star is legit, independent of Shimon agreeing that the star was written. And if he can't, then he has to bring the raya through Chazak. Frek the Gemara, if you want to say that Reb Shimon ben Gamliel takes the position of Tzarech L'Kaimei, I'm going to show you a brisa where Reb Shimon ben Gamliel holds Ein Tzarech L'Kaimei. The Tanya we learned, Shnai Madukim B'Shtar. There's a Malv and a Loiva that are holding on to the star, and the Loiva says, I dropped it because I already paid back. And the Malv said, no, I dropped it, and you didn't pay back. Malv Omer Shalihu, V'nafal Mimenu Umatzasai, and you found it. The Loiva Omer Shalihu, the change Shalihu, Uparaitivlach, and I already paid, and I dropped the star. So the halach is Yiskayim Ashtar B'Choismav Divei Rebbe. Rebbe holds you have to be Mekayim the star. And then at first glance it seems, and then the malva can collect in full. Rab Shimon Gamliel Omer Yachloiku, he only takes half. The Avinaba and the Gemara out of Kasher. How could the Rabbanon say that once you're Mekayim the star, automatically we assume that the malva dropped it? The loiv is holding on to it now. The Leslie the Rebbe had it now and Shnayim Oxum Metalis. Zoymer Nimitzasia, Zoymer Nimitzasia, Zay Yishava Sheila Bapachas Michatzeha, Vizay Yishava Sheila Pachas Mechetcha, Viachloiku. We have a Meforshim Mishnah in Shai Mochson that says the Allah is Yachloiku. So how could Rabbi say that all you need to do is be Mekayim the star and then the malva gets it and the malva can collect the complete debt? That doesn't line up. It's not consistent with the first Mishnah in Shai Mochson. That's not the pshat. The best case scenario for the malva is that he could only get 50%. That's only if they were independent Eidim verifying that this was a legitimate star. Keep looking. You know what the machlokes is between Rebbe and Reb Shimon ben Gamliel is b'she'enim mekuyim. Rebbe savar moed v'shtar shekosvay tzorich l'kaymay. The reason why Rebbe says it's kaymay shtar b'choismov because if you don't, the malva gets nothing at all. If the malva can independently verify the star, then at least he'll get half. And Reb Shimon Gamliel holds you don't need that. The Levi agrees it was a legitimate star. He just complains that he just claims that he dropped it. So therefore, you say achloiku even without the malva being mekayim. So therefore, evi mekayim le gavi palga. Rebbe holds when does the malva have a claim for half? Only if he independently was mekayim the star. If he can't be mekayim the star, then he cannot collect anything with it. So we have here a massive problem because we just said a moment ago that Reb Shimon Gamliel held you need chazaka, star won't work because and here Reb Shimon ben Gamliel says let's just flip it around and let's say in our case that we just quoted over here, Reb Shimon ben Gamliel says which will be consistent with our brisa, and let's say that Rebbe holds in tzorich l'kaim. That's one shot. And we'll really agree that Reb Shimon Gamliel holds moed b'shtar shekosvay ein tzorich l'kaim. So what's the problem in our sugya? Elahacha b'levarer kamifli. He comes along and says, "I have chazaka and I have a star." So they tell him, "Okay, very nice, but you have a chazaka and you have a star. Okay." Let me see the star. Let me see the star. And they'll say, I don't have it right now. I can't find it. So the halach is once I offer up two rayas, do I have to produce those two rayas? I didn't have to offer up two rayas. If I had a raya that I had a chazaka, that would have been adequate for me to hold on to that property. But I was a knacker. I said, I have two rayas. Could Bezdin demand that if you claim you had two rayas, produce those two rayas? So Reb Shimon Gamliel says, you only have to prove a chazaka. Because even though I said that I had two rayas, if I can't bring the second raya, we could rely on the only raya of chazaka. But Rebbe said, since you said you had a star, we will no longer rely only on chazaka. Now you have to produce the star as well. So the question is, Bilavar Kamevim. Ki had Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yosef have a masik bezuzeh. The Rabba owed money to Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yosef, and I believe the Tziyodim changed it to Rabbi Chia bar Yosef. So Rabbi Abba owed Rabbi Chia bar Yosef money. Also, like Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha. So Rabbi Chia bar Yosef took Rabbi Abba to the Bezdin of Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha so that he can force Rabbi Abba to pay up. Omar, so Rabbi Abba claimed, for Aticha, I paid you, bifnei ploini uploini. Not only did I pay you, now normally, this was not a milva b'shtar, this is a milva al-peh. A milva al-peh, I could tie the paraiti, and I'm neman. But Abba was a knacker. And Rabbi Abba said, not only did I paid you in front of Reuven and Shimon Edom. Amalei Rabbi Yitzchak, so Rabbi Yitzchak said, oh yeah, you paid in front of Edom? Produce them. Yavayu ploini v'ya'idu. Bring them. So Rabbi Abba says, why do I have to bring them? Amalei, you're not going to believe me if I don't bring Edom? But you should believe me anyway. The milvas chaver be'edim ain't tzarich l'par be'edim. So I'm never to say paraiti. Just because I said I had Edom, I have to bring the Edom up. Amarle ano bahi kishmaitza the marsvirli. I don't know what you want from me, Rabba. I hold like you yourself. You yourself hold that you should be mechuyev to bring those edim. Why? Domar Abba Amar Bata Bar Abba Amar Rav. Ha'imar lechaveir praticha b'fnei ploini uploini. The halach is tzarich shiavayu ploini uploini v'yayidu. Once you claim you have that extra raya, now they could demand of you that you bring that raya. So you, Rabba, claim you paid in front of Reuven and Shimon, produce them. And if you don't, I'm going to have to force you to pay. Amalei, so Rabbi Yitzchak, so Rabbi Abba said back, but the Amar of Gidol Amar Rav halacha kedivi Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. The halacha is like Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, and Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel over here says clearly that moida that he holds that you could just bring chazaka. You don't have to bring star. Meaning Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel holds that even though I claimed I had the star as well, I could still rely only on the raya of chazaka. V'af REBBI lo yamar, and even REBBI who argues by us and says that you still have to produce the star, that's el levayer. That's only to show that to back up my words. Amar lei. So Rabbi Yitzchak told him, "I'm sorry, I know nami levayer kamina. I agree with that, and if you're not going to be able to produce the edim, you're going to have to pay the b'chiyah by Yosy." So at the end of the day, we have multiple ways to understand the machloikis between Rebbe and Rabbi Shimon Gamliel in the case of star. Either the discussion could be Eide Chasima Karsi or Eide Masira Karsi. I'm sorry, we should go back. There was a having to say the machloikis is whether or not Oishis Nixis B'Masira. The Gemara didn't like that pshat because it produced a steer in Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. So then the Gemara decided to use Eide Chasima Karsi or Eide Masira Karsi, where Rebbe says you can use the star even though it's a pasala aid because you go basala Eide Masira, while Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says it's the chesidim that are important. If they're possible, you can't use them. That was modified because everybody agrees by mezuyif mitoichai with a pasal the star is not good. So that was modified to say that the star had no edim on it at all. And Rebbe Lezer holds edim asir kasi, which would be the position of Rebbe, why you could still use that star. That would have been a good kinyan, but it wouldn't be good for a raya. You'd have to have a raya. You'd have to have the edim asir produced, and Reb Meir and in our Sugi Reb Shimon Gamliel holds that would not be a valid star at all. So that was the second shot that we had that stuck. Then we had the question of Moide B'Shtar Shekosvoi Tzarech L'Kaimoi or not. And the question is here, the Moicher, Shimon agreed he wrote the star, but he claimed he never gave it, right? So that would be the Machloikis, where Rebbe holds that's why you can use the star as a raya, while Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel said that you have to be mekayim, if not, you have to raya on a chazaka. So here chazaka means the raya, not the kinyan, right? So we just switched over from raya to kinyan. Before now, we were talking about if the star would be a good kinyan. Like if Eidich Simakarshi, then the star won't work for kinyan. Now we're talking about using the star as a raya, and then we had the last shot of levayer. Once you claim you have the raya of star, do we force you to produce that raya or not? Okay, Zok Gemara weiter. Mi shapara mixas chayvay. Someone owed $100,000 and he paid off $50,000. So what are you going to do now with this star? Rabbi Yehuda Omer Yachlev. Rabbi Yehuda says that the Eidim on their own could swap out the star and write a new star that records that half of the money is still owed. Now, they'll tear it up. What's important is, if you look at the Rashbam, what will the date be on the new star? Will it be the date where this change was made, or will it be the date of the original? The nafkamina is if he'll be able to be toifus from lekuchos. So the Rashbam says here, there's a lot of discussion about it, mizman rishon kidem afarish begamor. They can backdate the star that they're signing today that records part of the loan. Rabbi Yosy Omer, no, yichtov shover. They just write a receipt. So here's the discussion of who do we put the onus on having to watch this document. Amar Yehuda, by writing a receipt to the loiva, now you're going to put a whole new responsibility on the loiva to have to protect this new document. Amar Rabbi Yosy says, let him. Kach yafaloi. It's good for him that he should watch that shover. v'lo yera koicha shozeh, so that it shouldn't hurt, the malva that we have to now write a new star for the malva. That lashon of v'lo yera koicha, you might ask, why is it so bad? How is it ruining the malva's koich? Just because he has to hold on to a document? So that's going to come into play. Amar Rav Huna Amar Rav. Ein halacha loik Rabbi Yehuda v'loik Rabbi Yosy. I argue on Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah, and I argue on Rabbi Yosy in the Mishnah.
What's the difference from if he has to watch his first document or second document?
For the malva.
Yeah.
That's a very good kasha. So why is there a yera koichai? Very good child. Ella, I halt v'kadim nicht. Zok Rav. And Rav Tana Hu Polag. Rav can argue. Ella bezdin mekar nashtar. Not the Adim write a new star, but they have to go to Bezdin. Bezdin will tear up the original star. They can do that. The koisvin loy star acham isman rishay. They could backdate a star because they have Hefker. Bezdin Hefker, they have a right to backdate a star. Adim don't have a right to backdate a star. I'm learning the Gemara like the Rashbam. There's a long Toshus that learns differently. Amalei Rab Nachman Rav Huna.
Why don't they write that the Tchilit was this and it was paid?
That's a very good question. Hold that question. Amalei Rab Nachman Rav Huna. But Amalei Rab Yirmiyah bar Abel Rav Huna. Ishmiya Leila Rav ha Brisa. If Rav would have heard the Brisa that we're going to be quoting on Daf Kuf Ayin Aleph Amud Aleph tomorrow, the Tanya Edim Mekarinus a star. The Edim tear up the star. The Koistin Lo Star Acham Izman Rishon. So if Rav would have heard that Brisa that says very explicitly that the Edim do it, have a Haderbe, he would have been Chayzer. So it must be Amarlei Shmielei. It must be that Rav didn't hear about it. So they told him back, never mind. Shmielei Rav heard about it, V'lei Haderbe, and it didn't scare him. Even though he heard about it, it didn't scare him. He's still arguing on it. Tosfos asks in one of his kashas on Rashi's pshat is, I don't understand. The Rav wasn't afraid to argue with the Mishnah. So you're going to threaten him with the Brisa? So that's why Tosfos doesn't like Rashi's pshat. The Rashbam's pshat, I'm sorry, I said the Rashi to Rashbam. The Rashbam's pshat is the discussion is that if it's Edim, how could you backdate the star from day one? So it has to be best in backdating the star. The Tosfos learns that the whole shaila is about whether or not you actually backdate the star. Tosfos learns that in the Mishnah you don't backdate the star. It's not Mizman Rishon. And Oibazoi, that explains why it's V'lo Yera Koichai Shel Zeh. In other words, if you write a shover, then the malva can hold on to his original star from the original date. But if you're writing a new star, like what Rabbi Yehuda says, right? If you write a new star, the new star that Adam write, he argues under Shpam and says that the new star will be dated the day that they wrote the new star. So now the malva is losing, because now the malva can no longer collect from the Lukuchais from the date of the original Chay. He could only collect from the Lukuchais from the date of the new star Chay. So that's how Chaim, you see how there's how the Gemara considers your argument. I mean, at least what the Tosfos is using your argument to argue in Rashi. Okay, so Zok the Gemara very quickly. Bishlama Beis Dina. I understand if Bezin do this, Alimi Lafkuyim Emoina. They could backdate stars because they have the power of Hefker, Bezin Hefker. Ela Edim Sha'asu Shlichusan Chayzin Vaysin Shlichusan. Can they write up a new star that is not legit? Okay, we'll stop here. Like I said, I have my juk. I have to get on to Amud Aleph, but we'll be mamshich tomorrow. Sorry? Right.
Okay.
Yes, we did leave it with the cliffhangers, so the audience is going to have to toil with this thought in their minds. Try to focus on work today, but hopefully we'll be able to be okay.